That process, that experience of exploration and discovery, and having the revelation when you find something like, wow, this is something no one's ever done before. I'm gonna get this and share it with people. That is the most thrilling part of photography.
Hi, welcome to Pixels, where we explore the heart and art of photography. I'm Beth Bilo, and I am so glad that you've decided to join me. Pixels is a project of the Nature Photography Collective, where we provide virtual and in-person opportunities to help nature photographers who are interested in deeper connections to create more impactful images so they can confidently and consistently express themselves. I'm pleased to welcome Ian Plant to the podcast. Whether hanging over the rim of an active volcano or braving the elements to photograph critically endangered species, Ian Plant has spent the past 2 decades traveling the globe in his never-ending quest to capture the beauty of our world with his camera. Ian has reached hundreds of thousands of people in his mission to inspire and educate others in the art of photography. Ian is the author of dozens of books and instructional videos, an instructor for KelbyOne and other photography education outlets, and founder of PhotoMasters, a site dedicated to photography, education, and inspiration. You'll find links to Ian's website and other resources mentioned in the show description. Let us know in the comments what was most useful to you or what stood out, what was meaningful. Your likes and shares are always welcome, and please do subscribe so that you don't miss a future episode. Now, on to the conversation. Hi, Ian. Welcome to Pixels. So glad to be chatting with you today.
Hey, Beth. Thank you so much for having me on, and hello to everyone in the audience.
Yes, thank you for acknowledging them. Yes, exactly.
They
We're
exist.
not having this. They exist, and we're not having this conversation in a vacuum. So, yeah, thank you for that. What's been giving you energy these days?
That is a fantastically loaded question.
It's
Because
kind of
you're
meant to be,
assuming
sort of.
well, you're assuming that something is giving me energy these
I
days.
am. I am assuming. I know. It used to be what's making you smile, and that's making an assumption that you're smiling. So I figured energy is a little more neutral, but
Well, yeah, that's it's an interesting question because I'm sure this is something we'll talk about, but finding creative energy
Mhm.
is often challenging. I think that it's pretty easy to get stuck in a creative rut. And I
Yeah.
feel like I've been in a creative rut for the past 6 months. And so I'm trying to get out of it. So what's giving me energy right now is the hope that I'll get out of my creative rut
Yeah,
relatively soon.
exactly. Exactly. It's like I want to, and that's enough for now. Yeah. How do you know when you're in a rut? What happens?
Yeah, so I usually what happens, how I know I'm in a rut. It's when I am on a photo shoot and I'm just not feeling inspired.
Mhm.
And so sometimes it gets so bad where I'm not even taking out my camera. Like I know I
Mhm.
should be taking photos,
Mhm.
but I'm being dismissive of it for whatever reason. I'm like, well, I don't think there's anything good here, so I'm not going to even bother trying.
Yeah.
And to quote the great Wayne Gretzky, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Yep.
And so it's a bad thing because I think the best way to get out of a creative rut is to engage in the creative process, get the creative
Mhm.
juices flowing, so to speak.
Mhm. Mhm.
And when you're not even picking up the camera, then you know you've hit rock bottom.
Yeah. Yeah. And no place to go but up.
Right. Hopefully.
Hopefully. Hopefully. Yeah. It's somewhat comforting to hear that everyone gets into ruts, even
Mhm.
those that we look up to that seem to be producing, fantastic images and even going to fantastic places. Like, how could you be stuck when there's so much and you see this way? That it happens to all of us.
Yeah, it's a common theme. I mean, and whenever I talk about this with my audience, there's a lot of reaction from people. They're like, "Oh, I'm so glad to hear that this happens to you as well." So I think it's
Yeah.
pretty common. And so, like, I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer by talking about the creative rut that I'm in. It's it's just
Oh,
something that
no,
happened.
no.
Um, but it is. I mean, it is something that happens. It happens a lot, and
Yeah.
it happens to people who are doing this full time, doing it seriously, as well as it happens to people who are kind of doing it more as a hobby.
Right.
And I find that with me, it probably like I get stuck in a serious rut maybe once every 2 or 3 years. Yeah. And so I'll have these periods where I feel like I'm just sort of in a creative plateau. Like I'm not really moving forward, but I'm not moving back. And then I'll have these periods where I feel like I'm just doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different
Right.
results.
Yeah.
And that's when I feel like I'm actually taking a step back and I'm not
Mhm.
realizing my full potential. And
Yeah.
then every now and then, and usually it's at the end of one of these creative ruts, when you see the light at the end of the tunnel. And the reason why the creative rut ends is you have an artistic epiphany. Like you realize there's
Hmm.
a different way of seeing that you haven't tried before. And you do it and it works. And suddenly you feel like your skill and your craft goes up dramatically. You leave the plateau and you take a major step forward. So, in a way, these creative downturns are good
Yep.
because they, if you can push through them, they can lead to a creative upturn, in theory.
Yeah.
At least I hope.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things we talk about in coaching is breakdown, breakthrough. And so often what precedes some sort of breakthrough in vision, perspective,
Mm.
opportunity is it's preceded by that breakdown or that rut that feels like the bottom has fallen out. And it's there that if you take that opportunity to, like you said, to move through it, don't just sink into it and kind of wallow there, but look to see what's the information in this
Yeah,
and continue to push and, like you said, engage in the creative activity. That's when the possibility for that, it's like you're making room for the breakthrough
right.
by having that rut and sort of like clearing the decks maybe.
Yeah, yeah, and it's okay to wallow for a while. Like
Yeah.
wallowing serves its purpose. It
Yeah.
sometimes can be a little bit fun to just kind of get bitter and angry and
That's right.
just revel in
Righteous
it for a
anger.
while.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't try to force your way out of it, I think is one thing that I would have experienced.
Mhm.
Because the more you force it, sometimes like you're just creating more resistance.
Yeah, and that's a good point because I often argue that you've got to force your way through it. You've got
Mm,
to just force yourself to get behind the lens and get creative to move out of it. But you're right. Sometimes that can be counterproductive. Sometimes it's
yeah.
that you're just pushing too fast, too hard, and you're not really ready for that breakthrough. I like the way you phrase
Yeah.
that: breakdown leading to a breakthrough. I'm
Yeah.
gonna I'm
Yeah.
gonna use I'm gonna use that now. I'm
Please.
gonna put a positive spin on my current breakdown.
Exactly. Good. Good. That breakthrough is right around the corner. Well, when I look at your work, besides just, I think of the two words that come up are awe and intensity. and and so I'm curious about how you feel like your work reflects you as a person.
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think the answer is that it doesn't.
Hmm.
That my who I am as a person and the art I create are two separate things. And that's probably not true. They probably have a significant influence on one on the other. I've heard some photographers who will talk about the photos that they're making and they will say, well, this represents the mood I had at the time. Like I was kind of in a
Right.
dark place. And so I was creating dark and stormy images. And I remember hearing this thinking to myself that for me, that doesn't make any sense. Like I like making dark, moody images, but I'm not doing it because I'm in a bad mood. I'm
Right.
actually pretty
Right.
excited when I'm making those dark and stormy images because I'm getting the things that I want. And so my personal mood is is actually pretty upbeat in those moments, even though I'm trying to create a photograph that's conveying something a little bit more foreboding. I think that the evolution of my art is largely untethered from my personality, my mood, and who I am as a person. I think the only area that where there's any overlap, maybe the intensity that you're talking about, is
Hmm.
that intensity is part of my personality. I want to excel at what I do, and I work very hard to get it. And so that is, in my opinion, a necessary component to go out and make successful photographs. You have to have
Yeah.
persistence, you have to have
Hmm.
patience, you have to be willing to keep at it until you get what you want. And so I think that intensity drives my art, but I'm not sure that that component of my personality is necessarily reflected in the art.
Very interesting. Yeah, I appreciate it's like it doesn't necessarily have to reflect our personality, but something maybe of our of our essence. It's something that goes a little bit deeper that maybe is getting reflected. Like you said, like you could take that word intensity and say commitment. Like there's a commitment that I see in the art and that I'm hearing from you. And that's not to force this connection, but like you said, there might be just that little bit of overlap that informs maybe how it shows up.
Yeah, and I don't mean to suggest that I'm absolutely 100% right in this self-assessment. People are usually pretty bad at judging themselves, and so maybe I'm completely wrong about this. But like having that ability to be self-critical, I think, is important to being an artist. So I'm hoping that my skills at self-assessment are maybe better than the average person, because as an artist, you know that you have to be very self-critical of your own work if you want to advance forward with it. So you have to be able to recognize the flaws that you have in your work and your approach if you want to get past those. So yeah, I mean, I just don't think that my personal mood has much of an impact on what I'm creating. It might have an impact on whether I'm creating, but not on what I'm creating, I guess is what I'm
that's
saying.
a great distinction.
Yeah.
Yeah, very important distinction. You talked about that, cultivating the ability to be self-critical and to assess our own work. How, if someone feels like they're not able to be objective with their own work in order to sort of interrogate it in that way, and I mean that in the best way.
Right, of course.
How could they get started with that, or what's a path to developing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a difficult thing to develop because we all have a real strong emotional connection with our work. And a bit of advice I got when I was first starting, and I'm sure other photographers have heard this, is that the experience you had making the photo doesn't determine whether the photo is good or not. Like if you had a really challenging time making the photo, the fact that you might have been stuck in the mud up to your neck in a thunderstorm when a volcano was erupting behind you and a polar bear was stalking you, like the fact that there was all these challenges that you encountered.
Boy, I would be in a pickle.
I just kind of got ridiculous with my hypothetical there.
I loved it.
But the point being that I've seen photographers who will they'll post an image and they'll talk about the challenges that they went through to make the image. And, the backstory can be really interesting, but ultimately the backstory doesn't make people who are looking at the photographs appreciate the photo more or less. They're going to judge the photograph on its own merits. When I was starting out, someone told me that hey, it doesn't really matter what you experienced. It doesn't really matter what you went through to get the photo. At the end of the day, everyone's going to judge it on its own merits. So you need to separate yourself from that. And so that was an early bit of advice that got me thinking about, okay, well, I need to be more honest in my self-assessment about my photos and my strengths and weaknesses as an artist if I'm going to, really expand my creative vision. So you got to know what you're doing wrong as much as you know what you're doing right if you're going to explore your talent and be the best photographer you can be. That all starts with honesty. It's just important to be honest as much as you can. I mean, it's challenging. We all have this emotional connection to our work. I also think that the key to art is seeing something that other people aren't seeing. It's sharing what you see with others. So part of that is that you might be seeing something that other people aren't getting. But you got to remember that as an artist, your job is to translate your vision so that others can see what you're seeing. Seeing what other people aren't seeing is just the first step of the process. Figuring out how to make them see what you see is the second and equally important part of the process. Always remembering that those two things exist side by side is important, because you might see something and you get really excited about it and you take a photo of it. But if no one else sees it, it's the tree falling in the forest that no one hears, I suppose. And so I this is a constant theme with myself and with some of my professional colleagues, where we just get really excited about something that we've done, and then we feel crestfallen when we share the image and no one else sees it. They're just like, whatever, like, it's a
Mhm.
nice shot, but it's not, I don't know why you're so excited about it. So, it's important to always remember that distinction between those and to constantly be evaluating your work from both your perspective as an artist, but also trying to imagine the perspective of the viewer, how they're going to react to what you've
Mhm.
created.
Okay, so like 4 different trains of thought came up as you were sharing all of that. I'm trying to decide if I pull all the threads or just one of them.
We're all over the place.
No, it's all good. It's just like lots of popping here in my head. If I can keep them all, I'll try. But one of them is, I understand what you're saying about that. Like the backstory
Mhm.
isn't important to the viewer. And I remember reading somewhere on a forum or something, somebody commenting, I don't care if you were up to your, neck in mud and whatever. It's whatever,
Yeah.
it's about the image. So basically what you were saying, and I thought, that's interesting, because one thing I've been curious about with the rise of AI, and especially, being able to like throw in a few prompts and come up with some grand landscape image that has no backstory, then the backstory becomes the part that humanizes it
Yeah.
and maybe causes some sort of connection. So I feel tension between those two truths, that it doesn't matter and it absolutely matters. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a great point. If I can reframe what you've said, to me, what the problem with reliance on AI to generate images, to generate art, is that as an artist, you're creating something incredible. Perhaps, well, you're not really creating it. You're just typing in a few words. The computer is creating it. You're just sort of
Yeah.
selecting what you think is best from what the computer gives you. But the key thing that bothers me about that is that I don't have the experience of creating the art. So I don't think the experience that you have is necessarily relevant to the viewer's response to your work.
Mhm.
But as an artist, as a photographer, that experience is the whole reason why I do this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what, if there's one thing that gets me smiling, that gets me excited, that's what is that thing, is being out there and having the experience. I'm mindful of the fact that when I'm having the experience, no matter how great it is or how bad it is,
Mhm.
when I'm up to
Mhm.
my neck in
Yeah.
mud, or, and the polar bear is trying to kill me, or
Yeah.
whatever is happening, as like, whatever emotions I'm having during that experience, I'm mindful of the fact that my job is to somehow translate that experience so that the viewer can appreciate it on a vicarious level. And
Yeah.
to me, that's the challenge. When we talk about the importance of telling a story with our photographs, that is part of what I'm talking about. It's learning to
Mhm.
share the experience, or at the very least to trigger something with the viewer. You're trying
Yeah.
to trigger a visual and an emotional response. You want them to be transported into a story. It doesn't have to be
Mhm.
the story you're trying to tell them. It doesn't have to be the
Yeah.
real story. But as long as they're
Mhm.
looking at your work and they're coming up with a story on their own, you've incited their curiosity, then you've made a connection with them
Yeah.
and the work is going to resonate more. And so I'm always mindful of how I can take my experience, capture it with my camera, and then sort of through my choices of exposure value and composition and the moment to trigger the shutter, etc., how I can trigger a response from the viewer so that they become a part of the story or
Mhm.
they start telling their own story.
Wonderful. Yeah. And that brings me to one of the other threads, and I'm only remembering 2 of my 4. So the other ones will come to me later, I'm sure. But this one actually pops because of something I was listening to yesterday. So I listened to the NPR show Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me.
Mhm.
And they have, various guests on that they're talking to. And in this particular episode, they were talking to the gentleman that was the producer for the song Uptown Funk. Okay. So stay with me.
This is great so far.
And so the person talking to him said, like, did you know this was going to be a big hit, or how did that feel? And he said, well, as long as the song was being created by, as long as it was with us, it was ours. But as soon as it went out there to the public, as soon as it hit the radio, it wasn't ours anymore. It belongs to the listeners. I hear that frequently, and I actually try to think of that myself. Like, once I put an image out there, it's no longer mine. I have no control over how somebody interprets it, what story they put to it, whether they like or dislike it or whatever. And yet I'm still invested in their response. So I'm not exactly sure what my question is, but that it has something to do with that ownership. Like, if you're talking about, like, my job is to translate something of my story through that, or how I interpreted it, how do you balance, if you balance that with also just letting it go and being what it is out in the wild?
I think letting it go is maybe a bit easier for me than what you're describing, because even though I'm mindful of trying to translate my experience, even though my goal is to share my creative vision so that people can understand where I'm coming from as an artist. Ultimately, I'm also aware of the fact that you can't control the reaction that people are going to have. You can do your best to invite them to see what you see, but sometimes they won't. Sometimes they'll see it, but they just won't like it. Sometimes they'll see something that you never saw.
Yeah, exactly.
And, so sometimes it can be good when their reaction is outside of your control. Sometimes it can be bad, but ultimately you can't control it. And I'm fine with that. I'm not doing this to get validation, I guess. Like, it's great when people like my work, but when they don't, that doesn't bother me. I know what I like, and I feel that at least some people are going to get where I'm coming from. That's okay if that's all it is. If it's more than some people, that's even better. But ultimately, my love of photography, my love of creating photographic art comes from within, not from without. And so, like, I remember a long time ago on an online photo sharing forum, there was a thread, if there was a zombie apocalypse tomorrow, would you still be taking photos? And half of the photographers were like, oh yeah, definitely, I'd keep taking photos. The other half were like, no, I take photos to share with people if there's no people. If it's just zombies, then I'm not going to take any photos. What's the point?
Yeah.
And my reaction was always, you can pry my camera out of my cold, dead zombie hands. I would be, even when the zombie horde is descending on me, I'd be there with my camera in those last moments, trying to get that perfect angle and capture the fleeting backlighting on one of the zombies' head as he's reaching in to chomp my brains. That's how I'm planning on going out. And
there's no other way. And there's no choice.
And I know after they eat my brains, the zombies are not going to look at my photos and appreciate them, but that's okay. That's not why I made the photos. It wasn't really for them. It was for me. So
yeah, exactly. That's a really good and very vivid image to hold of that. Yeah. I've heard a similar question. Like, if you went out and you made this big trip and you forgot your memory card, and so there's no way that what you did could be recorded, would you still set your camera maybe to, like, fire without memory card and just take photos, practice seeing the world that way? And so it's an interesting reflection.
That's actually a more interesting question, because is it the act of photography that I love, or is it getting the final product? And I love the process. I enjoy the act, but if I did all that and didn't get something on the far end, I'd probably feel like I was wasting my time. So like the final product is definitely important to me. And, if I've got enough time, I'll make a big print before the zombies get me, so that force them to see it. And, the joke's on them. If they're after me for my brains, it's going to be a very light meal. So
it's like a fast food.
Yeah.
It just goes.
It's at best an amuse-bouche.
Gotcha. We've touched on this, maybe just a sliver, but I think I want to hear more about what you say around getting off the beaten path. And maybe this actually, I think what it goes to is maybe that rut you mentioned. You find yourself taking the same images over and over again. So getting off the beaten path can be both a literal and a figurative, metaphorical kind of way of looking at it. But what is your perspective on why it's important to get off the beaten path and how we might cultivate that skill or that tendency if it doesn't quite come naturally?
I think that maybe I can begin answering the question by explaining what the beaten path is. And so the most beaten path I've ever seen in my experience would be Instagram. Specifically, a very weird phenomenon that I've noticed in the past few years. Instagram photo tours, where people line up by the busload to go on a tour of famous Instagram spots so that they can take their own Instagram photo at that spot. I've seen this.
Yeah.
And it's weird. You see like 30 or 40 people get off the bus and they all line up to pose or to take a picture of this famous Instagram spot.
Yeah.
And then they move on to the next one. So that's clearly the beaten path. And so think of the opposite of that as being off the beaten path. Photographing the things that are being overlooked by other people. So often that means making a conscious choice not to go to a famous exotic photo location where everyone goes and takes the same pictures. It could mean just going somewhere that no one else is going, like going to a local place, exploring your local area to see what it has to offer. And, I tell people, keep in mind that something is only exotic from your own point of view. Like you may think of like some foreign destination as being exotic and you go there. But when you're there, the local people are looking at you very strangely. They're wondering why you're so excited about photographing the things that they see every day. And, I ask people to imagine, how would you feel if you left your house in your neighborhood and suddenly a busload of photographers showed up and started taking pictures of the squirrels in your front yard? You'd probably think that they were crazy. But if they came from a place where they don't have squirrels, they think of it as this super exotic animal, right? What's exotic is entirely dependent on your perspective, your point of view. And I like to tell people you need to find the exotic close to home.
Yes.
So instead of traveling all the way around the world to go photograph some animal that you think is super exotic, why not set up in your backyard and photograph the squirrels that are there? People might think you're nuts, but you could do an amazing study of the secret lives of the squirrels in your backyard.
Right.
And, like seeing the artistic potential of those everyday subjects, finding a way to explore their hidden beauty and then sharing it with other people, that is how you make amazing photographs. And whether it's the squirrels in your backyard or tigers in India or whatever it is you're photographing, it's the same process. You don't want to just point your camera at stuff and take pictures of it. You want to be able to dig a little deeper and to be creative as an artist to make compelling photographs. And you can make compelling photographs of any subject if you learn how to do it. And so that's off the beaten path in a very literal way is just kind of avoiding some of the hot spots and going to the lesser known spots. Or exploring lesser known subjects. But getting off the beaten path can also just be looking for a different perspective or angle, looking for a different way of making photographs. So even if you're in a popular place, you can still try to do something different. You can still try to see something that everyone else is overlooking. And so it's really just a kind of a perspective shift that you've got to force yourself into. And I think the easiest way to make that shift is to make a conscious decision not to go photograph the shots. Every place has got the shots. You go to a popular national park like Yosemite, and there's spots where everyone lines up. Or like you go to Grand Teton, and you go to the famous places like Snake River Overlook or Schrodinger's Landing, and you show up and there's 200 people there, all fighting for one spot. That is the spot. And do your best to avoid it, because all you're going to do is take the pictures that everyone else has taken. Yeah. So instead of going there, just go somewhere else. Go to the place where the other photographers are. Yeah. And go there with an open mind. Just explore. Don't go on Instagram and catalog all the shots that people have taken that you like, and then go and find those shots. Just go and explore on your own. Just as you're driving down the park road, stop. Get out, walk around, check things out, find something unique, something original. To me, that's what getting off the beaten path is.
Yeah, lovely. Again, lots of things popping up. One of them is doing that exploring without your camera. Because sometimes I think when I have my camera in my hand, I start thinking like a photographer in terms of like composition, light, this, that, instead of just taking in what's around me. I'm judging more when I'm evaluating, I think sometimes when I have my camera. So removing that and what you were sharing there at the last part makes me, and I've brought up Cole Thompson so many times on this podcast, it's ridiculous, but it made me think about an application of his photographic celibacy philosophy, which is if you're going to a new location, either a new location or even just one that is tried and true that maybe you can conjure up some images in your head. Make a practice. Don't go on Instagram. Don't Google image that location and just trust that when you show up, you'll be able to see more landmarks in your mind's eye.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think that the key to being successful as a photographic artist is learning how to find your own compositions, finding your own moments. Yeah. And you can't do that if you have the landmarks in your head and you're just going from shot to shot. I'm not a purist, like I don't personally subscribe to photo celibacy. Like, I will, before I go to an area, I will do a little bit of research to see what other people are doing there, just so I could get a sense of the potential. But what I don't do is I don't start creating catalog of, I've got to go there. I've got to go there. When you see it, you want it. You want to possess it yourself. When you see a good shot taken by someone else, it's natural to say, yeah, I want that shot too. But you got to resist that. And you've got to go out on your own and find your own compositions, because that is how you learn the art of photography, is learning how to solve the visual puzzle of the world around us. Yeah. And you'll never learn that if you're just copying other people's solutions. So, I mean, I think that's very important, is to engage in this process, if for no other reason than to learn how to do it. One thing that I love doing is going to a famous photo location and finding some unique way of approaching the scene or subject that no one's ever thought of before. It makes me a better photographer practicing that. Ultimately, I think that sometimes it's a bit of a challenge finding something new. Like the photo icons are famous for a reason. They resonate with people. And so if you go and just copy the famous photo icons, people are going to really like it. And sometimes it's a bit challenging showing people something that isn't already embedded in their consciousness as being one of the icons. It may take longer for people to warm up to it, or for it to achieve any sort of positive reception. So it's a more challenging path to take, getting off the beaten path. But I think it's ultimately the best path.
Yeah, you're making me think, like, if I were to say I went to Death Valley, and the second time I went, I didn't go to any of the dunes. So I have no dune images. And I can imagine somebody saying, what? You went to Death Valley and there's no dunes? Yeah, no dunes.
Well, a place like Death Valley is enormous. But the percentage of the park that's actually been photographed is probably like only 2%.
Yeah.
There's literally 98% of the park that people haven't really explored with their camera. And so it can't possibly be that the only good places to photograph are the dunes or Badwater, or some of the other, the racetrack. Like, there's so much to do there, so much to uncover. Yeah. And that process, that experience of exploration and discovery, and having the revelation when you find something like, wow, this is something no one's ever done before. I'm going to get this and share it with people. That is the most thrilling part of photography.
Hi, I'm popping in here just with a quick invitation to join us over at the Nature Photography Collective. We've engaged some of the world's leading photographers in creating content designed to support your development and identity as a photographer. Whether it's the North American or international speaker series, the Nature Photography Academy community, workshops, or mastermind groups, you have lots of ways to engage with an amazing group of photographers. Your membership gets you access to hundreds of hours of live and archived learning opportunities. You can learn more and become a member at naturephotocollective.com. Well, let's look at some photography. Let's look at some photography. I'd love to. I want to pull up some of your images that you shared, and talk about how they represent different pieces of your creative journey. So, what is this amazing, intense image that we're seeing now?
So let me ask you, you probably know what it is, but like imagine you were just seeing this for the first time. What would you think that it is?
The Eye of Sauron.
Mission accomplished. That's what I was going for.
That's what I see. But volcanic activity.
Yeah.
And like I said, it's hot, it's intense, and it's interesting the contrast between the hot and the cold blue around it. So I see a lot. So tell us about it.
Well, yeah, I asked that question. This gets back to what we were talking about earlier about telling a story with your photographs, but inviting the viewer to come up with their own story. And this is a photograph that I get different reactions from people. Some people see the Eye of Sauron. Some people see like a dragon's eye. I've heard people tell me that they see a beating heart. And so these are all perfectly valid interpretations. When I was making this photo, I was definitely seeing an eye, though I think I was seeing more like a dragon eye than the eye of Sauron. But yeah, like what I was seeing is kind of irrelevant to the viewer. Like I'm just hoping to create an image that's going to get them telling their own story. So this is a drone photo I took over the volcano in Iceland that's been erupting on again and off again for the past few years. And in the early part of its eruption, you could actually go and visit the volcano. You could hike up to it and you could just stand there with the volcano erupting a few hundred feet away from you. So it was a really intense experience. With the latest eruptions, it's been much more dangerous. And so they've closed off access for most people with the past few eruptions. And it's also been getting steadily closer and closer to a town there, which is really unfortunate for the people living there. I made this photograph with a drone. A drone is a great way to photograph a volcano because
for lots of reasons.
Yeah. Chiefly among them being that it doesn't really care if it gets swallowed by liquid hot magma. Whereas I would be very, very sad about getting swallowed by liquid hot magma. And so the volcano was erupting every few minutes. And so it would have a period of explosive eruption for several minutes and then it would quiet down. And then the pressure would build up again and it would erupt again. And so during one of these relatively quiet periods, I flew my drone right over the crater of the volcano, looking down at the lava lake that was churning within the volcano. And I selected time of day for this carefully. I shot this after the sunset during twilight because I wanted the twilight blues to be illuminating the landscape because I wanted to have that color contrast that you mentioned. And so that was very intentional to have the cool blue of twilight on the landscape juxtaposed against the warm orange and reds of the lava. And so I was just fascinated by the fractal pattern of the lava lake. That's just the lava churning inside the crater. And then the patterns created by the magma that it spilled out over the edges that's resting on the crater. And so I was intentionally trying to create this eye look with this composition. So I got my drone into position to sort of emphasize that. And then just waiting for the right timing to create that color contrast. I think that, you definitely, when you're telling a story with your photos, you've got to be thinking not about the story itself. You should be thinking about the story, but you should also separately be thinking about composition and the creative use of color and light, because these things can help you tell the story. They can help provoke a visual response. So I was very intentionally choosing my composition to assist that storytelling process. And, intentionally adding a level of abstraction to this photo. Because I think that when you imbue your photos with a sense of mystery, then you're more likely to incite the viewer to start that storytelling process. And so there's a lot of ways you can inject mystery into your photos. One way is by choosing a composition that's more abstract and less photorealistic. And so I got down low with the drone over the the volcano. So you can't really see the entire scene. You're just seeing a small portion of it. And that small portion that you're seeing is sufficiently abstract that the viewer has to take a moment to figure out what's going on. And when
Yeah.
they're taking that moment to figure out what's going on, that's when they start that storytelling process for themselves, or at least hopefully.
Yeah, one of my favorite reactions that someone might have to one of my photos, and I mostly do abstract, is I have no idea what I'm looking at, but I really like it, or it's very cool, or this is what I like. I like that that there's that mystery to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that abstract art can be very, very difficult to do right.
Hmm.
There's a lot of abstract art out there that's just abstract, not necessarily good. But when you do it
Right.
right and
Mhm.
people really positively react to it, even though they don't know what they're seeing,
Yeah.
that is an indication that you've got a really good understanding of composition and the use of light and
Mm-hmm.
color, because
Mm-hmm.
you're able to trigger a reaction, even though what you're presenting to them is completely untethered from
Right.
anything, any preconceived ideas that the viewer might have. They don't
Hmm.
know what they're looking at, as you said, but they still love it. That's
Right.
a great moment.
Yeah, yeah, it's one of my favorites. And since you said that someone interpreted this as a beating heart, like, that's how I'm seeing it now, and I think it's very cool. Like like it's I almost think of it as like the heart of the earth, like trying to like burst out here. So, what a cool way that that person saw it, or those people. Yeah, so let's take a look at the next image. Very different. Tell us about this.
This is a really dramatic sunset sky over the desert of Utah. And
Mhm.
this is kind of an off the beat path place. It's, the space in between a bunch of famous national parks. And it's a bit of a no man's land. I think some photographers have been discovering it in recent years, so it's getting a bit more popular. But it's still something that's relative to the national parks around it. It's still pretty much off the beaten path. It's just the kind of place where you can go exploring and be there for days and never see a single other person or a single other photographer, which is my kind of place. Those are the
Yeah,
kind of places I like to explore.
sounds lovely.
And yeah, and this is more photorealistic than the
Mhm.
previous photo, but understanding how to see artistic abstraction is important to making successful compositions, whether you're trying to create abstract art or trying to create something that's more photorealistic. And so what I mean by that is that I'm constantly deconstructing the world around me into these simple shapes and luminosity values and colors. So I'm thinking of the scene not in terms of mountain, cloud, sunset. I'm thinking instead of triangle
Mm.
and yellow
Mhm.
and all of these abstract artistic components. So I'm breaking the world down into them and then reassembling the pieces into the composition that I'm creating. And so when I was making this photo, I had this brilliant sunset going on. It was an amazing sunset. Like, I watched these clouds build up all day over the desert, but the western horizon remained clear. So I knew that at sunset, the light was going to break through and I was going to get a really dramatic, colorful sunset. And that's exactly what happened. So the clouds were textured, and just the very bottom parts of the clouds were getting light at this moment.
Mhm.
And so the rest of the clouds were in shadow. So the interplay of light and shadow on the clouds was creating this diagonal array, this pattern of converging diagonal shapes. And so I intentionally sought out a foreground that would mirror or
Yeah.
repeat those shapes. So when I,
Mhm.
I found these erosion lines in the claystone, basically I was standing on a hill and these were the erosion lines going down the side of the hill. That was the perfect foreground because
Yeah.
that's creating a complementary diagonal array that mirrors the shapes in the sky. So I'm always looking for a way to tie the shapes together when I'm doing
Yeah.
landscape photo between the sky and the land, finding shapes that relate to or mirror one another.
Mhm.
And so always thinking about it in these abstract terms, even when I'm producing something that's not fully abstract, but is somewhat or mostly photorealistic, is really, really important to this process of creating a successful composition.
And it feels like that's not something that we hear a lot about. Like I can imagine standing in this spot and saying, "Ooh, look at those clouds." That sun, like I would see that the obvious scene, but taking that moment, slowing down, backing up, and saying, "What will complement this? What will complete the picture with that mirroring?" That feels like that's like that next level that we don't often either see or hear talked about a lot.
Well, the pretty sunset or the landscape scenery isn't really the subject.
Right,
It's just
exactly.
pieces of the overall puzzle that you're trying to put together.
Yeah.
And so I've got photos of this pretty sunset where I wasn't really finding that perfect, interesting foreground. And they're just not that engaging. They're just
Right.
pictures of a pretty sunset. But this
Yeah.
is transforming that into something else, or at least that's my
Yeah.
goal,
Yeah.
is to create a visual response by thinking very critically about the composition and the use of shapes. So
Yeah.
having those leading lines coming in from the foreground and having a relationship between those leading lines and what's going on in the sky above, that's important to transforming this pretty sunset into a successful photographic composition.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And yeah, I appreciate the dissection a little bit of that. And that reminder, and that's one thing I've learned with the abstract art, when somebody says, "What did you photograph?" I think, well, the object isn't as important as like the subject of that photo is the color, the lines, the light, whatever it is, the texture.
Mm.
It's not whatever happened to be the catalyst for it.
Yes, that is a brilliant way of putting it. And I talk about that. I tell
Mhm.
people that your subject is not your subject.
Right,
The
right.
composition that you're creating, the overall photo is your subject.
Mhm.
Your subject is just a portion of that. If you
Yeah.
if you think about your subject as being a polar bear and you see a polar bear and you just zoom in on the polar bear, you'll have some pictures of polar bears. People probably will like it because they like polar bears, but you're not making an artistic composition. You're just pointing your camera at something that looks cool. And
Right.
so when you realize that your subject is actually the overall visual design, that's when you start making photographs that are more likely to resonate with people.
Now for something completely different. Although I will say when juxtaposed with the image we just saw,
Mhm.
there's a parallel. There's a theme, there's a thread, even if it's very different. So tell us about what we're looking at here.
Okay, so this is the redwoods of California, and
Hmm.
I photographed the redwoods on a foggy day, which is the best time to photograph the redwoods. It's kind of one of those things. Once you shoot the redwoods in fog, you never go back to normal weather.
Oh, I'm
So
sure.
yeah, because especially when it's a thin layer of fog and you get light intersecting with the fog, it creates
Mm.
this scattering of light, creating the sunbeams, and it's really magical. And so, one theme of my work is the importance of the intersection of light and water.
Mm.
We
Mhm.
think of like landscape photographers are always talking about how they're chasing the light.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm chasing moisture instead because it's when moisture and light interact that you get real magic. So
Yeah.
moisture creates clouds, and clouds might, catch light at sunrise or sunset, bringing color and drama into your photos. When light goes through fog or mist, which is, moisture in the air, you get these magical, ethereal photo effects. Water can be used for reflections. So I think as an outdoor photographer, water is an important part of what I'm doing. So here, like the reason why I feel that shooting the redwoods without that moisture component is a bit less exciting is because the moisture helps tell the story. I
Mhm.
think that weather is so important for landscape photography because it really helps tell the story of the landscape. And each landscape, it's got kind of its own weather event that's important.
Yeah.
And so for the redwoods, getting fog is so important to telling the story of the landscape. For other locations, like I love going to Badlands National Park in South Dakota, and the key weather event there are the summer thunderstorms. You get
Mm.
these massive storms coming in. You get these amazing sunrise and sunset skies as a result, and that's the key component to telling that story. You talked about sand dunes earlier. Wind is
Yeah.
the key component to really telling the story of the sand dune landscape because wind gets rid of the footprints. It creates these it creates the dunes, and
Yeah.
it creates the features on the dunes that are photogenic, the ripples and the hard crests. And when you got blowing sand in the air catching the light, that just brings the dunes to life.
Yeah.
And so the weather is an important part of telling the story of the landscape here, getting that storytelling process going with the viewer. And so that's one key component of this photo. Exposure value is another way you can tell a story. I've talked about intentionally creating mystery in
Mm-hmm.
one's photo. So, making the work more abstract. One other way you can, the weather can help enhance the mystery of the photo as well. And another way is by choosing an exposure value that's different from the way people perceive things. So here, I left most of the scene in silhouette. So I'm shooting directly into the light, and I set my exposure to control and protect the highlights. And I let anything that's in shadow go dark, go into silhouette. And I think that just enhances the mystery. It also helps make the shapes more prominent. So here, part of what this composition is a study of is diagonal lines. And so you've got the diagonal lines formed by the sun rays passing through the fog. Those are all converging on the sun, which is the point of interest in the background of this photo. The redwood trees that are leaning in because of the perspective distortion, using a wide angle lens looking up, causes those trees to lean in. So those converging diagonal lines are also working here, helping to get the viewer exploring specific parts of the image.
Yeah.
And so this is I think this is a very abstract photo. I mean, I think even my photorealistic shots are very abstract in a sense.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking about all of these things to enhance the mystery and help tell the story. The critical part here, I've seen lots of photos of the redwoods where there's fog and there's sunbeams, and people just take a photo of the sunbeams coming through the fog. For me, what makes this stand out from most of the other redwood photos that I've seen, once again, I was very intentional about this, was including some sort of foreground element. And so having that beam of light illuminating the foliage at the bottom of the forest, selecting a position where that was happening, I think is really critical. It just enhances the visual design. My goal was to have multiple points of visual interest to get the viewer's eye bouncing back and forth. So this is kind of like a traditional landscape photo where there's a foreground and a background, except that the foreground in this particular shot wasn't very close to me. Everything was kind of farther away with this wide angle perspective, but it's at the bottom of the image frame, so it kind of serves as that foreground.
Yeah.
And so that's what I was going for here, trying to create that visual response at the same time, trying to also trigger an emotional response by adding these elements of mystery and telling the story of the landscape by incorporating the weather event into the overall visual design. When you're doing landscape photography, I think it's a good idea to catalog what's special about the landscape. And then you try to feature those aspects to help tell its story. And so weather is just one of those things, and so I knew going into photographing this that the fog was what I really wanted. And when I had fog one morning out of the entire week that I was there, that's when I made all the photos of the redwoods that I liked.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
because I knew that was the critical component.
Definitely. Well, if you're going to borrow Breakdown Breakthrough, I'm going to borrow Chasing Moisture. Because I hadn't thought about it that way before, but it's so true. And weather, is obviously a big component of that. But
yeah, I mean, if you think about it, weather is all about moisture interacting with the air. Like it's clouds, it's lightning, it's rainbows. These are all caused by moisture. Yeah,
it's the magic. And I mean, when you think about it, life is because of water. So it's all connected. That's very deep.
I wasn't intending to get very deep about that, but you're right. We have touched upon something very profound here. So
yes, we have. So we can check that box for the day. My profound thought for the day, deep thoughts with Beth and Ian. But yeah, one of the things, like you said, there's a very abstract component to this image, and at the same time, I can play, because of the perspective that you've chosen, at least the more I look at it, the more I can place myself in the scene. And I'm imagining myself lying on that forest floor and looking up, and I can feel it. I can feel the air and the weak sun, trying to kind of cut through. So that perspective really makes a difference, at least for me, in contributing to the story and putting me in the photo.
Yeah, I like the way you phrase that, because that's exactly what you're trying to do with your photography, is to put the viewer in the photo, give them that
Mhm.
vicarious experience. And
Yeah.
and if you think about it, photography is a stingy thief. It steals so much of the world. When you take
Mm.
a photograph, you lose depth, you lose motion, energy,
Yeah.
vitality, life. You lose most of what you're experiencing, because what you're presenting is usually a narrower view of the scene that you perceive in front of you. And so
Yeah.
you're robbing the viewer of 95% or more. I'm just making
Hmm.
an arbitrary number here. You're robbing the viewer of most of what the experience is. And so your
Yeah.
job as a photographer is to try to restore all of that. You have to
Mm.
think very creatively about how you're going to bring back this illusion of depth, this illusion of
Right.
motion and energy. And
Yeah.
your choices, you're trying to bring back all the things that the photograph is robbing from the world
Hmm.
and present that to the viewer. And that's the real challenge.
Yeah. Oh, and that makes me kind of excited, just because, we often think of like, I want others to see what I saw,
Yeah,
but we have to remember, I want others to feel what I felt, or I want them to smell what I smelled, or,
yeah.
the, how can you engage more of the senses in the way you choose to capture that image?
And that whole thing I just said, the photography is a stingy thief, that's
Yeah, that was such a great phrase.
completely original and new to this podcast.
Trademark. Okay.
I am it's gonna be everywhere. I'm gonna write up like a blog post about this or something like that.
Awesome.
Uh,
Awesome.
but you
Well,
heard it here first.
I know when I'm interviewed, I always love that, those moments when I say something I've never said before. I'm like, yes. And so if that comes up for the guest on this podcast, that makes me even more excited. So I'm looking forward to stingythief.com to being a thing. The t-shirts, all of it.
This all happened because of you. You prompted that thought.
Exactly.
So
Oh my goodness. Let's look at one more before we shift gears, because I'm
Mhm.
curious to hear a little bit about this image. And again, I'm seeing that threat, that theme of those leading lines and that long perspective. Yeah, tell us about this one.
Yeah, so I'm a wide angle addict. I love wide angle photography,
Hmm.
and the wider the better. I
Yeah.
like extreme wide angle, and
What
part
is
of why I love it.
extreme? Tell me what's extreme. Like, what's the
Well, the
millimeter?
focal length here is 9 millimeters on a full
Ooh,
frame
okay.
camera.
Ooh,
Yeah, so that's so wide that I've got to be careful, because my feet and my tripod legs are
yeah,
constantly getting in my photos.
yeah.
So the reason why I like these extreme wide angles is wide angle lenses kind of have a unique way of distorting the perception of the world. They make everything
Hmm.
look really small,
Yeah.
and you can get very close with a wide angle lens to make something look much bigger. And so the focal length makes the background look smaller, and then you get close to a foreground object and make it look unnaturally large. And I like that because it challenges viewer perception. That's not the way human beings perceive things. So it's a way of presenting the world in a different way, kind of showing something to people that they haven't seen before. And it also creates a strong compositional effect
Yeah.
by getting close to something and making it big, and then having that background a little bit smaller. It creates this narrowing of perspective that hopefully just creates this sense of depth in the photo that draws the viewer in. And when
Hmm.
you create that illusion of depth, that's also going to create the illusion of motion and energy for the
Yeah.
viewer, because they're going to feel like they're being sucked into the photo, and that gets them moving, that gets their eye moving. So I love that wide angle perspective, how it does that. And so this is a 9 millimeter photo taken in Valley Fire State Park in Nevada,
Hmm.
which is a lovely place, beautiful, beautiful sandstone formations there. And you can also see what I was talking about earlier, is that mirroring of the shapes. And so there was
Yes.
this storm that came in. It was a sunny morning at first, but then this thunderstorm came in. And as it was rolling in, I was getting all these beautiful dramatic clouds in the sky. And so I waited for a moment where I've got this really nice curving storm cloud because it was mirroring the curving shapes of the sandstone fins in the foreground. And those shapes are really revealed by the interplay of shadow and light. So
Yep.
when you're thinking abstractly about shapes, you realize that shapes aren't just created by the physical shape of objects. Shapes can be revealed by the interplay of shadow and light or by the contrast of colors.
Mm-hmm.
And so these are all of these abstract components. So you can see that artistic abstraction in this photo. And it really is. It's not a picture of the sandstone of Valley of Fire. It's not a photograph of White Dome, which is in the background. Kind of like it's the Half Dome of Nevada. It's something that looks just like Half Dome in Yosemite, but much smaller. It's not a photo of that. This is a photo of the intersection of the curving shapes of the foreground relating to the curving shapes formed by the clouds in the sky, and how those shapes kind of swirl around one another, bringing the eye to the point of interest, the background scenery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is done beautifully because, I'm seeing that sort of S curve that's happening there, as well as seeing sort of these parallel lines going that way. And it keeps your eye moving like you want, like moving around the frame. And it seems like it's this, along with the other images that we've looked at so far, are that demonstration of off the beaten path being taken via perspective. In really looking at something from a way that's unusual and unexpected.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like people don't come here to photograph. And, this is a spot that's just, I don't know, maybe 100 feet, 200 feet away from the parking area. It's not that I went deep into the wilderness to get off the beaten path here. I just chose a framing and a perspective. And, my choice of foreground versus the background, that was the part that was different, that was unique.
Right.
Something that I hadn't really seen before.
Yeah. Yeah. Lovely. Well, thanks for sharing all of those. And we, as per usual, I have more images from you that we're not able to dive into, but they'll be shared in the video. So can't wait for folks to see that. And of course, including links to your website so people can browse at their leisure and take a look at more. I'm curious about one more thing before we kind of land the plane. And this comes from your artist statement. I'm always curious about other photographers' artist statements. And in yours, you state photography is as much about the experience as it is about the final product, which I think has come up, a couple of times here.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, maybe just to bottom line, what is your experience of photography, and what is the relationship between your experience and that final image?
I love engaging in the craft of photography. Like, just getting behind the lens, to me, that's how I get my energy. Getting back to the question that you asked earlier. And that's why I advocate to people, if you're in a creative rut, the best way to get out of it is to just start being creative. Once you get moving, then things start happening again. I think the experience is part of the magic of photography. It's what makes photography unique. So, like, obviously there's other types of art, painting, for example. Painting and photography are very similar. They're both two-dimensional art. But what's different between the two is that painting is really something that exists outside of reality. You can paint a real scene, or you can paint something that's a total flight of fancy. Like Salvador Dali didn't actually see melted clocks, right?
Right.
And so the painter creates the painting. Even if they're copying reality, they're still fully creating it. It's fully within their control what they create. Photography is different because the photographer is capturing reality. And of course, the photographer can manipulate reality. Like a studio photographer can set up the scene that they want to photograph. Right. So there's obviously some overlap with painting there. But the photograph itself still captures a slice of reality. It's tethered to reality. You need a real object with real light to make a photograph. And so that tether to reality, I think, is very important to what makes photography unique. And I also think it's important for people who view photography. They want to know that the photograph is quote unquote real.
Sure.
When they find out it's not real, then they lose interest. There's something
Mhm.
about that tether to reality that is the unique magic of photography. And I think that tether to reality has been increasingly tugged, stretched, warped with digital technology.
Mhm.
And don't get me wrong, I love working in the digital darkroom. I love being able to optimize my images, but I think it's important to always keep that solid tether to reality with your work so that it stays photography. Because if you're manipulating the image extensively in the digital darkroom and you're weakening that tether to photography, to the real, you're weakening that tether to reality. What you're doing is you're transforming it from a photograph into some other kind of art. So it's becoming more like a painting, I guess. I'm
Mhm.
not, you could call it mixed media. It's a, blend between photography and computer art, or whatever you want to call it. But the more you do that, the more that you're creating the magic after the fact and not
Mhm.
capturing the magic, the weaker that bond with reality gets. And
Mm.
you'll see that, like if you're sharing your work with someone like who's not a photographer, just an average person, like you're at an art fair, the question that you're going to get more than anything when they look at your photographs is going to be, is this real? They want to know whether,
Mhm.
and maybe it's unfair because they don't look at a painting and say, is this real? But that's how people perceive photography. That is the unique magic of photography, is that tether with reality. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And with AI image generation, that tether is going to get stretched and pulled and warped even more.
Yeah.
And so to me, and we talked about this earlier, to me, the magic of photography is it's not just the way the viewer looks at it. It's not just what makes it different than painting or some sort of digital art. The unique magic of photography for the photographer is that experience, having that experience. There is nothing like the feeling you get when you're out there and the shot you've been waiting to get all week finally comes together, and you get that
Yeah.
that perfect sunset, or you've spent a week in the savannah of Africa waiting for the opportunity to get the one shot that you've always wanted of a cheetah or something like that. When you are able to take the creative vision in your mind and wait for the real world to spontaneously align with that vision, the moment that happens, there's no greater feeling. It is
Mhm.
it is it is just a complete and total intense sugar high.
Yeah.
And I don't want to rob myself of that experience. Sure, I can take a photo and bring it into Photoshop and do all sorts of heavy manipulation. I can change the sky to make it better. I can throw in some AI image generation to add a polar bear jumping up in the
In
background
the
or whatever. I
redwoods.
mean, I can do whatever I want and make something
Yeah.
that's amazing that people go nuts over. But in doing so, I've robbed myself of the experience of actually capturing that, witnessing that in reality.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah. I just well, I'm again thinking about like so for you, part of the definition of a photograph is some tethering in reality.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think so. Like that's what a
Mhm.
photograph is. It's just
Mhm.
it's something that plucks a slice of reality from the
Yeah.
living world and preserves it forever. That's how a photograph works. When that becomes a small part of the process, then we're doing something else. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like
Right.
there's nothing wrong with being more of a digital artist than a photographer, if that's the
Mhm.
path you want to choose. But I got into this being a photographer. I got into this when back in the day when people were using film. And so the only thing that determined what your photograph looked like were the decisions you made before you triggered the shutter. There was no post processing. People who
Right.
were shooting
Right.
color slide film, for
Yeah.
example, like the only post processing was sending your film to a lab, and they
Mhm.
did a standard process. So you had to actually, really learn how composition works and how light
Yeah.
works and color works, so that you could make the right decisions before you triggered the shutter. And I think a lot of people who've come up in the digital photography age haven't learned that, and instead
Mhm.
they're just creating this stuff in the computer. I think they're missing out, because I think that true photographic mastery comes when you learn how to do all those things. And I don't know. I mean, to me, that's what photography was. And so I guess I'm too old of a dog to learn new tricks. So
Well, we've got to carry the torch, forward. Like if a photo is grounded in reality, it's like we as photographers have to be grounded in something. It
yeah.
seems like there has to be some foundational piece that we can agree on, even as we differ in maybe how it manifests or, how it evolves. But it seems like that question of what is photography,
Yeah.
what is a photograph, has come up more since AI has reared its ugly head.
And I think I'm going to put this in a very extreme way to illustrate the point and why that experience of making the photograph is so important. With AI, you can sit in your basement in your underwear, all alone, in front of a computer doing AI image generation. You can create the perfect photo of a polar bear.
Yeah.
You can create a whole body of work of polar bears and throw them out there, and people might just love what you've done or love what the AI has done at your prompting. But wouldn't it be better to actually go
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
see and photograph a polar bear? I think
Yes.
so.
Yes. Yes.
And so that's what I'm always keeping in mind is
Yeah.
that when you're creating the magic on the computer versus experiencing and capturing that magic in reality, you're robbing yourself
Yeah.
of that
Yeah.
experience.
I can't tell you how many times it's been my camera that has gotten me out of bed or kept me up or made me get on a plane or get out there and do something.
Yeah.
Because unlike a lot of the landscape photographers I talk to, like I don't have this back history of lots of camping and backpacking and
Yeah.
all of that kind of stuff. And hiking, doing big intense hikes and stuff. So for me, it has shifted my relationship to nature and gotten me out more and been a catalyst for getting out there and experiencing it. So going backwards and saying, oh, I can just put in a few keywords, that's definitely going backwards in my mind.
Yeah, and like the new AI technology does actually offer a lot of positive things to
Yeah,
photographers. I mean,
it
the new
does.
like AI generative fill is so much better than the old stuff,
Yeah.
and like the AI powered autofocus is amazing. But
Mm-hmm.
I've got a little anecdote to tell you. I know I'm probably stretching this out longer than it should be, but how you talked about how photography has changed your relationship
Yeah.
to nature, for example. I mean, it's kind of changed my relationship to everything. And
Mm-hmm.
so I remember when I got married on my honeymoon, I got up one morning. My wife and I stayed at this beautiful mountain resort. So I got up for sunrise one morning to photograph sunrise over the lake that was outside the resort. And I come back to the room, and my wife is still in bed, and she's grumpy because I woke her up when I got up
Right.
early. And she's like, "What is wrong with you? Why are you taking pictures on our honeymoon?" She's like,
Yeah.
"I'm your wife. Shouldn't I be the priority?" And I just sort of laughed and I said, "Honey, I'm married to the camera. You're just my mistress." Uh,
And are you still married?
yes, she understood that I've just got a wicked sense of humor. But in a way, it's kind of true. I mean, photography is my life. It really,
Yeah.
when I first picked up a camera 20 years ago or 30 years ago, it was just on a lark. I thought it'd be a hobby. I didn't realize it would become this all-consuming passion that
Mm-hmm.
is the only thing that I care about. Like recently, someone asked me, like, "What do you do for fun? What are your hobbies?" And I'm like, "Photography."
Mm-hmm.
They're like, "No,
Yeah.
you do that for a living. What do you do for fun?" I'm like, "Photography. What do you think I do in my spare time? I take pictures."
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. And that's what a wonderful place to be in life
Yes.
where, yeah, the hobby and the profession collide in a happy way.
Well, there's nothing better than being a creative person. I find
Yeah.
it very difficult to relate to normal people. And so the only time I truly feel comfortable is when I'm around other creative people.
Yeah. I always wonder, I'm like, why doesn't everybody do this?
Yeah.
Like, why wouldn't anybody be excited to pick up a camera and do this and do that? And it's like, oh yeah, we're wired differently. And
Right.
there's and I'm just grateful that that I'm on that creative side, you're on the creative side, and we find our peeps and grow together. So
We're the
it's
lucky
cool.
ones.
Yeah, lucky ones. So, so are there any resources that you find yourself recommending to people on a regular basis that you think would be useful for the audience to know about?
Well, I mean, there's a ton of great resources out there, and you can just hop on YouTube and find all sorts of instructional videos, etc. Of course, that's part of the problem. There's so much out there
Yeah.
that it's hard to know what's good and what's not and what's going to help you. And so I may be a little bit biased, but I recommend my own photo education
Hmm.
platform, photomasters.com. It's
Yeah.
a curated source of information. So it's basically me sharing my artistic practices and vision and trying to help other people become the best photographers that they can be. And it's not just me, I'm also interviewing lots of pro photographers over on the site. So there's lots of different inputs and points of view as well. But I definitely would recommend that for people who are looking to take their creative vision to the next level.
And so, in addition to PhotoMasters and your website, any place else that you hang out online where folks can find you and follow?
Yeah, I think they can find me on Instagram and Facebook. So definitely you
Okay.
can check those out. But probably my personal website and my PhotoMasters site is the best way to stay up to date with what I'm doing.
Awesome. And you do workshops, one-on-ones, different ways that people can engage with you?
Yeah, so I tend not to do many photo tours. I do photo workshops that
Hmm.
are designed with education in mind, and so there's a
Okay.
heavy emphasis on that. And I do just a few of them every year. So I do like a
Hmm.
landscape masterclass in Badlands National Park every summer. Then I do a nightscapes masterclass there in September. So you got the summer storm season in the first half of summer, and the second half things dry out and you've got lots of
Yeah.
great clear skies for doing Milky Way landscapes. And so those are my two primary sets of teaching workshops that I do. And I also typically will go down to the Texas Bayou in November
Mm.
when it's peak fall color, and I do a fun photo tour there where I take people out on my motorboat and we explore the hidden places within the Big
Mm.
Cypress Bayou. It's one of the most hauntingly beautiful places on earth. And so that's
Yeah.
really my focus is the photo education.
Yeah, I took a look at that Bayou workshop and just the image I saw that you used to promote it. Good choice, because it made me want to like say, "Here, take all my money." But
Mission
yeah,
accomplished.
yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I should also mention, you are going to be one of the speakers at the Horizons Photo Conference that's happening in Durango in October, and I'll be there with you, not sharing the stage at the same time, but at least there as a fellow presenter. And I'm really looking forward to that, and hope folks will check that out as well.
Yes, definitely. That's going to be a great place for advanced photo learning. And Beth, I'm looking
Yeah,
forward to seeing you in real life, hanging out
yeah,
and
same.
exchanging more ideas. When we talk, we come up with really amazing things. So I
I
think
think
there
so
has to
too.
be more of that.
Absolutely. More, please. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ian. It's been a great pleasure. And yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me on and thanks for letting me gab for a while. The trick is not getting me to start talking, it's getting me to stop. That's the
Stop.
problem. So,
Yep. I found that photographers are a talkative bunch, even though a lot of them say they're introverts, and I'm one myself. You get us going, and yeah, it's more of a how do we bring this to a close, right? So, yeah, thank you so much.
thank you. I had a great time.